Tonight, we travel back to a time when warmth was not a switch you could flip, but a fragile flame that decided whether you lived to see the morning. Imagine waking in a one-room hut half buried in the earth, your breath white in the air, your hands stiff from frost, and the single glow of a dying ember, the only thing standing between your family and the endless cold outside. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's step quietly into a world where every flicker of fire was a miracle. The year is around 1300, and winter has settled over a small medieval village somewhere in northern Europe. The fields that once shimmered gold with grain are now white and silent. The trees bare, their branches clawing at the grey sky. The air smells of smoke and damp straw. You can hear the faint sound of a distant church bell carried by the wind, its echo swallowed by snow. Inside each cottage a single fire burns, and every breath of heat is guarded like treasure. If you lived then, a peasant, tenant, or labourer, your home was not built for comfort. It was built for endurance. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and dung pressed between wooden beams, and though it kept out the wind, it never kept out the cold. The roofs, thatched thick with reeds or straw, sighed and rustled with every gust. There were no chimneys, no glass windows, no doors tight enough to seal the draught. Warmth was a visitor, not a resident. You can picture the scene now. A family gathered around a low fire pit in the centre of a smoke-darkened room. The father tends the embers with a stick. The mother stirs a thin pot of barley and onions, and the children sit close enough to feel the sting of heat on their faces and the bite of cold on their backs. The fire is their heart, fragile, smoky, alive. Every home revolved around a single source of heat. The open hearth. It was little more than a pit in the ground lined with stone, yet it carried the weight of life itself. The smoke rose freely, twisting in the air before escaping through a hole in the thatched roof, leaving everything it touched coated in soot. People coughed constantly, their eyes stung with tears, and yet they would have called this comfort, for without that smoke, the walls would weep with damp, the air would freeze, and the family would not last a week. Medieval people treated the fire almost as a living being, unpredictable, temperamental, and sacred. Each night before bed they banked the fire, covering the embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. Losing your flame was a small disaster. To rekindle it from flint and steel could take hours, and so neighbours often shared coals between houses, carrying them in small clay pots like offerings of light through the snow. The hearth was not just warmth, it was a symbol of the home itself. Here, food simmered slowly in iron pots. Here, children learned their first prayers. Here, families sang during long dark evenings when the cold made even silence ache. The smoke cured meat, dried herbs, and blackened the rafters until they gleamed with tar. A dark armor that kept away insects and rot. Everything revolved around this one point of light. You can almost hear it, the quiet crackle, the shifting sigh of the logs, the occasional pop that startles a sleeping child. The fire's rhythm is the rhythm of medieval life itself, patient, repetitive, and enduring. Outside, the world is frozen and hostile, but inside the fire breathes, and as long as it lives, so do they. The first thing you notice when you look around a peasant's home is how small it feels. The ceiling dips low, the air thick with smoke, and every surface seems to sweat with the chill that seeps through the walls. These walls were not dead stone. They were alive in their own way, breathing moisture, creaking under frost, whispering as the wind pressed against them. They were made from the land itself, mud mixed with straw and dung, pressed over woven branches called wattles, then left to dry until it hardened into a surface that could withstand rain and wind, but never quite defeat the cold. In summer, it held a faint smell of earth. In winter, it turned clammy, sucking warmth out of the room like a slow, invisible tide. Yet to those who built them, these walls were miracles, raised from nothing but soil, straw, and patience. If you pressed your palm against them, you would feel their texture, rough, uneven, speckled with straw fibers. Sometimes the walls even bore the fingerprints of the very hands that made them. The small ridges of women, men, and children who had kneaded the mixture with bare fingers until their skin cracked. The peasants' homes were not designed to shut out nature, but to bargain with it. Every winter they patched the cracks with fresh mud. Every spring they scraped away mold. Every few years they rebuilt the same walls again, one handful at a time. The floor beneath your feet is not wood or stone, but packed earth, beaten hard by generations of steps. It smells faintly of smoke and soil, warm near the fire and icy cold in the corners. To soften it, they scattered straw, rushes, and reeds across it, a thin cushion that rustled softly under every movement. In better households, herbs like lavender or mint were mixed into the rushes, releasing faint scents that masked the sourness of damp and the sweat of labor. Over time, layers built up, old rushes crushed into the ground, new ones laid on top, a living carpet of history. When the wind howled outside, the walls moaned softly, flexing as if alive. You could hear it all. The distant bark of a dog, the creak of frozen branches, the muffled clop of a horse's hooves through snow, each sound reaching through the mud and straw like a ghost. The house did not silence the world. It softened it, turning every noise into a gentle hum that matched the slow rhythm of breathing inside. At night, the family gathered close to the hearth, the only light in the room flickering over the walls like the heartbeat of the house. The smoke curled upward and clung to the rafters, darkening the beams until they shone black and oily. Sometimes a mouse scurried across them, or a chicken stirred in the shadows near the door. The air was thick, heavy, hard to breathe, yet this was safety. Outside lay death. Inside, even in smoke and stench, there was life. And when the cold grew too sharp to ignore, people turned to ingenuity. Moss was packed into cracks in the walls, straw stuffed beneath doors, even dung smeared into gaps where the wind slipped through. It sounds desperate, but in that desperation was genius. The smell might linger, but it kept frost from biting your toes. Every patch, every layer of straw, every handful of mud pressed into place was an act of quiet rebellion against winter itself. No insulation, no glass, no chimney, and yet, somehow, they endured, not by shutting out the world, but by living in rhythm with it. The peasants did not conquer the cold. They learned its language. Their homes did not promise warmth. They promised survival, and that in their world was enough. When the fire burned low, and the cold crept in through every gap in the wall, the peasant's first defense was not his house, but the fabric wrapped around his body. Clothes were not fashion. They were armor, thick, coarse, and heavy. They held the warmth that the fire could not. Each thread was a line drawn between life and death during the deep winters that swallowed the land. Wool was the savior of the poor. It was everywhere, on the backs of sheep that grazed the commons, and in the rough hands that spun it into yarn by firelight. Even when damp, wool clung to heat, trapping the body's warmth in small, invisible pockets. But it came with a price. It scratched the skin, smelled of lanolin and smoke, and grew stiff with use. Linen made from flax was worn underneath, softer and cooler, though it offered little defense against the frost. The combination, linen close to the skin, wool above it, became the uniform of survival. You can picture the scene. A man in a coarse brown tunic, belted at the waist, thick hose patched at the knees, boots stuffed with straw for insulation. His cloak hangs heavy across his shoulders, the edges singed from years spent too close to the fire. The woman beside him wears a long wool dress layered over a linen shift, her head covered with a cloth coif that hides her hair and traps the heat around her neck. Children wear whatever scraps remain, small tunics, cloaks that once belonged to their parents, rags wrapped around their feet instead of shoes. In these layers, every patch tells a story. A hole mended with darker thread marks a winter survived. A faded sleeve speaks of years in the field. Clothes were passed down through generations, reworked again and again until they could no longer hold a stitch. Even then, nothing was wasted. The remnants became bedding, padding for boots, or strips of cloth for the sick. At night, when the fire faded to embers, those same clothes became their blankets. People slept in everything they owned. They lay together on straw beds, children pressed between their parents, the weight of wool and bodies forming one shared pocket of warmth. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. To sleep apart was to wake with frozen limbs. The bed itself was a frame of rough wood filled with straw, sometimes stuffed into a linen sack called a tick. The straw rustled and poked, but it kept bodies off the damp earth. It was replaced rarely, maybe once or twice a year, and by spring it smelled of sweat, smoke, and soil. Yet to those who lay upon it after a day's labour in the cold, it felt like comfort itself. In the poorest cottages there were no separate rooms, no private corners. Animals often shared the space, a cow or goat in the adjoining stall, chickens roosting in the rafters. Their breath added warmth to the air, a living insulation that raised the temperature of the room by a few precious degrees. It sounds strange now, but to the medieval peasant, the heat of a cow was as valuable as that of a hearth. The line between home and barn was not one of shame, but survival. When the wind howled outside and the snow began to fall, the family huddled together beneath the same blanket of wool and straw. The fire cracked softly, the animals shifted in their sleep, and a faint warmth spread through the small smoky room. It wasn't comfort as we know it, but it was enough. In those long nights, closeness itself was heat, and the steady rhythm of shared breathing was the lullaby of winter. For the medieval peasant, warmth was never constant. It was earned, layer by layer, life by life. The fire, the wool, the straw, the body beside you. Each played its part, and when dawn came pale and cold, and the frost still clung to the walls, you rose, shivering, dressed in yesterday's smoke, and did it all again. When the wind cut through the village like a knife and the sky turned the colour of ash, the peasants found their next form of warmth, not in the hearth, but in the pot that hung above it. Food in the Middle Ages was never about taste. It was about heat, about feeding the body enough to keep it from collapsing in the cold. The meals of winter were thick, heavy, and slow, designed not to please the tongue but to push warmth through the blood, to make the heart beat harder against the frost. In every cottage, the smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of boiling grain. The staple of peasant life was pottage, a stew that never truly ended. Into that one blackened pot went whatever could be spared: barley, oats, leeks, turnips, onions, and sometimes, if luck or kindness allowed, a small piece of pork fat or bacon rind. The pottage simmered day after day, growing thicker, darker, richer with each addition, until it became the very scent of survival. A ladleful at dawn warmed your chest enough to face the cold fields. Another at night soothed your body before sleep. Bread was the other fire. Not the soft white loaves of the wealthy, but coarse, dark, heavy rounds made from rye or barley, baked in communal ovens shared by the entire village. The bread was dense, almost sour, but it lasted. A piece was often dipped into hot broth to soften it, transforming it from stone to comfort. The village bakehouse itself was a blessing, a rare place of light and warmth. When the oven was fired, neighbours gathered not only to bake but to thaw, standing shoulder to shoulder in the glow of shared flame. It was in these moments that the cold loosened its grip, replaced by laughter, gossip, and the smell of rising dough. Ale, too, was a kind of warmth. It was brewed weak but drunk daily, not for pleasure but for safety, since water often carried disease. The ale, thick and cloudy, filled the stomach and brought a flush to the cheeks. A sip before dawn made the morning feel almost tolerable. Children drank it too, their small cups watered down but still enough to warm them. For peasants, intoxication was not the goal. It was a side effect of survival. Meat, when it appeared, was almost sacred. A strip of salted pork, a bit of dried fish, or a bird caught in the hedgerow. These were treasures. Fat was the richest warmth of all. It burned in the stomach like an ember, keeping hunger quiet through the long hours between meals. Those who had animals used every part of them: bones boiled for broth, tallow rendered for candles, hides turned into clothing. Even scraps of suet or lard were hoarded as if they were gold, mixed with grain to stretch another meal. You can imagine the family now, gathered close to the fire, wooden bowls steaming in their hands. The youngest dips his bread into the pot, his face glowing in the firelight. The mother blows gently on a spoonful before passing it to her daughter. The father chews in silence, shoulders hunched from the cold, the smell of smoke and onions heavy in the air. Outside, the frost thickens, the night deepens, and the only warmth left in the world is the one they make for themselves. To eat together was to survive together. Each meal was a small ceremony, a moment of stillness between labors. Hunger and cold taught gratitude more than any sermon ever could. When the pot was empty, the mother would stir in water, scraping every last bit from the bottom. The fire might die before dawn, but the warmth of the meal lingered, slow, quiet, and human. And sometimes, on the rarest nights, there was celebration, the slaughtering of a pig, a feast before the deep fast of Lent, or the burning of the Yule log when winter was at its peak. Those were the moments when warmth became joy, when ale spilled, songs rose, and laughter filled the smoky air. For a few brief hours the cold was forgotten, the bellies were full, and the peasants felt rich in the only way that mattered. For in that world before central heating, warmth was not steady. It was earned, shared, and savoured. A fleeting flame that lived as much in the pot and the heart as in the fire itself. As the pale sun crept over the frozen fields, the peasants rose with it, not because they wished to, but because stillness meant cold. To stop moving was to surrender to the frost. In a world without central heating, labour itself became a form of warmth, every motion a way to keep the blood alive. Outside, the air was sharp and metallic, biting the nose and lips. Frost rimmed the edges of every thatched roof, and the fields crackled underfoot like broken glass. Yet even in that biting air, the sound of work began, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, the low creak of cartwheels, the soft murmur of voices carried on the wind. The village awoke like a great living furnace, each person a spark against the cold. Men headed toward the forests, their breath trailing behind them in long clouds as they swung their axes into frozen trees. Every blow sent a shudder through their arms and a wave of warmth through their bodies. They did not stop often. To pause was to let the chill return. The wood they gathered was more precious than coin, the promise of heat for weeks to come. Women worked closer to home, their hands never idle. They hauled water from wells rimmed with ice, scrubbed clothes stiff with frost, or spun wool beside the fading light of the hearth. The act of spinning was steady and rhythmic, a hum that filled the silence, and the friction of the wool between their fingers brought a quiet heat. Their sleeves were often damp, their faces flushed with effort, but the movement itself was life. Children helped in every small way they could. They carried bundles of kindling, swept snow from doorways, chased chickens from the roof beams. Even their play had purpose. Running, laughing, falling into drifts. It all kept them warm, even if only for a while. The cold taught its own kind of discipline. No one lingered, no one wasted energy without reason. The animals, too, worked with them. Oxen pulling carts, horses breaking the hard soil when thaw came, cows giving milk that steamed in the morning chill. Their body heat filled the barns, turning those dark spaces into heavens of breath and warmth. A peasant might linger beside his ox after fastening the yoke, pressing a hand to its flank, feeling that soft living heat and drawing comfort from it. Every motion, every task was part of the same rhythm. Chop, haul, mend, spin, breathe. The body never rested long enough to freeze. Even prayer in its way carried warmth. Hands clasped, breath whispered, voices rising together in the cold church air. They did not pray for comfort. They prayed for endurance, and that endurance was its own fire. When the day ended and dusk returned, the villagers trudged home, their limbs heavy but alive. Their clothes were damp from snow, their faces raw from wind, but the ache in their muscles was a familiar friend, proof that they had earned their place beside the fire. The hearth greeted them with smoke and light. Steam rose from their shoulders as they bent near the flames, their boots hissing as the frost melted off. The warmth that filled the room was not just heat. It was the warmth of labour transformed, of effort turned to survival. Each log on the fire, each pot simmering above it, had been bought with sweat and pain, and in that quiet satisfaction, the glow on tired faces, the smell of wood and wool, the soft breathing of children half asleep, there was a peace that no modern comfort can quite imitate. Because the truth was simple, work kept them warm, and warmth kept them human. In a world where the cold never truly left, it was motion, not comfort, that gave life its meaning. In the long stillness of winter, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the peasants did not see the cold merely as an enemy. It was a teacher, a quiet, relentless force that shaped their patience, their humility, and their faith. The frost was not just a season to be endured, but a kind of trial sent by God, a reminder that warmth was grace, and that survival itself was a daily miracle. Each morning began with a small act of devotion. Before tending the fire, before eating, the head of the household might whisper a short prayer, thanking God for another dawn. It was not eloquent, just a few words breathed into the smoke-filled air, but it carried weight. For in a world where the line between life and death was drawn by a smouldering ember, faith was not luxury, it was necessity. The cold was everywhere, pressing through the walls, biting the hands that prayed, turning the water in the church font to ice. Yet people came, trudging through the snow in wool cloaks and wooden shoes, their breath forming halos in the morning light. Inside the church, the air was no warmer than outside. The candles flickered weakly against the stone, and the voices of the congregation rose in slow, trembling chant. The priest's breath misted as he spoke, his words heavy and ancient, floating like incense through the chill. They endured the cold, not because they were numb to it, but because they saw meaning in endurance. To shiver during Mass, to kneel on frozen stone, was to share in the suffering of Christ, to prove devotion through discomfort. Warmth was for the body, faith for the soul. A candle's flame on the altar was a symbol not just of light, but of defiance. A small, unwavering fire that stood against darkness. At home, religion and warmth were intertwined. The hearth itself was sacred. Some families traced a cross in the ash before rekindling the morning fire. Others tossed in a pinch of salt or herbs to bless it. The flame was treated with reverence, almost as if it had a soul. Letting it die without prayer was said to anger the spirits of the home. Ancient echoes of older, pagan beliefs woven quietly into Christian life. During the harshest nights, when snow piled high and wolves howled beyond the village edge, people turned to stories, tales of saints who had endured hunger and cold, of angels who guarded travelers lost in storms, of sinners who mocked the fire and froze before dawn. These were not bedtime stories. They were lessons, shaping the heart to accept what could not be changed. The peasant's faith was not the gilded devotion of cathedrals. It was a humble faith of calloused hands and raw breath. It lived in the rhythm of the seasons, in the patience to wait for thaw, in the gratitude for every spark that caught in damp wood. The cold made them quiet, reflective, and resilient. It carved into them a deep understanding that all things, warmth, food, life, were borrowed, and must be cherished before they faded. On the feast days of midwinter, when candles filled the church, and songs rose in voices roughened by frost, warmth returned not from the fire, but from community. Neighbours gathered, clasped hands, and shared what they had. Bread was broken, ale poured, stories exchanged. For a few hours the cold was forgotten, replaced by something deeper than heat, the comfort of belonging, the shared breath of faith. The cold, in its way, had taught them unity. It stripped away pride and pretense until only necessity and compassion remained. In every trembling hand, every whispered prayer, there was a quiet acceptance that the world would always be harsh, but that even in its cruelty, God had left them fire and each other. When the night fell again and the wind rose over the hills, the village lights glowed faintly through the snow, each one a hearth, each one a small star in the endless dark. And for the medieval peasant, that was enough. Not comfort, not luxury, but a fragile, flickering warmth that reminded them that faith, like flame, was meant to be tended, never taken for granted. Even when spring was still far away, and the frost held the earth in silence, the peasants' homes pulsed with life beneath their layers of soot. The smoke never truly left them. It crept into every fibre of their clothes, every crack in the walls, every strand of hair. It was the smell of existence, bitter, sharp, and strangely comforting. To step into a medieval home was to step into a world wrapped in its own breath, half air and half ash. Inside, the fire did not burn with brilliance. It glowed, low, red, alive, in the centre of a dark room. Above it, the smoke swirled lazily toward the hole in the thatch, too heavy to escape quickly, drifting sideways before it rose. The upper half of the room was a cloud, blue-grey, and thick enough to sting the eyes. The peasants had learned to live beneath it, crouched low, moving by instinct through the haze. Their lungs ached, their throats rasped, and yet no one complained. Smoke meant warmth. To breathe it was to breathe proof of life. The rafters above their heads turned black and shiny, polished by years of soot and heat. Some beams gleamed like metal, slick with the residue of thousands of fires. The soot preserved the wood, sealing it against rot, so that what seemed like decay was in truth protection. Even filth had its purpose in that world. The dirtier the home, the stronger its bones. The air shimmered faintly in the firelight. Dust motes, ash, and smoke danced together like a single slow-moving tide. Shadows flickered across the walls, long, wavering silhouettes that seemed to move even when everyone sat still. A mother stirring her pot might look like a ghost caught in the smoke, her face half seen, her hands glowing as they passed through the light. The house was alive with movement that wasn't movement, the quiet flicker of heat painting the air with illusions. At times the smoke grew unbearable. The wind shifted, pressing it back down through the hole in the roof, choking the room in grey haze. Eyes burned, children coughed, and the air thickened until it felt like breathing through cloth. The father would rise then, open the door to let the air flow, and the cold would pour in, sharp, merciless, alive. The balance between warmth and suffocation was delicate, and every house learned it through experience. Still, the people believed the smoke was holy in its way. It cured meat, dried herbs, and sanctified the air. It was said to drive away evil spirits and sickness, though perhaps it only drove out insects and damp. The rafters above the fire were used like shelves. Sausages hung there to smoke, herbs dangled to dry, and bundles of garlic swayed gently in the haze. Over time, the smoke turned these things dark and leathery, preserving them for months. It was the oldest kind of alchemy, transforming decay into endurance through nothing but air and flame. And then there was the sound, the soft crackle of the logs, the faint hiss when sap met fire, the sigh of air rising through the roof hole. Together it created a rhythm that filled the silence between voices. For people who lived without clocks, this sound marked time as surely as a heartbeat. Morning fires crackled bright and loud. By night they whispered and murmured like tired storytellers. Children grew up beneath this haze, their hair smelling of smoke even in the fields, their lungs accustomed to the sting. They learned to watch the colour of the fire the way others learned to read. A dull orange meant damp wood, a bright gold meant good heat, a sudden flare meant danger. In that smoke they found comfort. In its sting they found safety. The houses might have been dark and airless, but they were never silent. The crackle of fire, the scrape of wooden spoons on clay pots, the murmured prayers before sleep, these sounds mixed with the smoke until they became part of it. The air carried everything: warmth, pain, fatigue, laughter. To modern eyes it might seem suffocating. To them it was home. By the light of that slow fire, a family could sit in peace, breathing the same smoky air, watching the embers fade to red. The cold pressed against the door, but the smoke curled around them like a blanket. In that strange equilibrium between breath and ash, light and shadow, they had everything they needed to last one more night. To a medieval peasant, the fire was not just warmth, it was presence. It breathed, it sighed, it lived, and it could die. And like all living things, it demanded respect. They did not speak of it as we do, in practical terms of heat and comfort. They spoke to it sometimes aloud as though it could listen. The hearth was the soul of the home, and the flame that glowed there was its guardian spirit. When a new fire was kindled, it was done with care, a prayer murmured under the breath, a sign of the cross traced through the smoke. To light a flame was to invoke both blessing and danger, to call forth a creature that could nourish or destroy. The peasants believed that if anger or quarrel broke out near the hearth, the fire would weaken, sulking like a wounded friend. If peace was restored, the flame would leap again, forgiving. There was wisdom in that superstition. They knew that a calm household was safer, that steady air and steady hearts made a steadier flame. Letting the fire die was an offence against both practicality and faith. A cold hearth meant neglect, laziness, even misfortune. At night, before sleeping, families performed the ritual of banking the fire, covering the glowing coals with ashes, whispering a short rhyme or prayer as they did it. In the morning they would uncover it carefully, blow gently, and feed it dry twigs until it woke again. This small act carried a sense of ceremony, repeated every day of every year. It was the thread that tied one dawn to the next. There were old stories, older than the church, that said each home's fire had a guardian spirit, often imagined as a small, invisible creature that lived beneath the coals. It hated neglect, feared water, and rewarded those who kept it clean and fed. Some said that when you heard a sudden pop or crack from the hearth, it was the spirit laughing. When sparks jumped onto the floor, it was angry and must be appeased. The church frowned on these tales, but the people never quite let them go. Faith, after all, needs warmth as much as reason. The fire also held memory. Each winter left its trace in the soot, the scars on the stones, the blackened iron pot that hung above it. The children would grow, marry, and move to other cottages, but the hearth remained, older than all of them, a silent witness to generations of hands reaching toward its light. To sit before it was to feel part of something larger, not just a family, but a chain of survival stretching backward through centuries. And yet it could turn against them in an instant. Every peasant knew the fear of waking to the smell of burning thatch, to the orange flicker devouring the roof. A single spark could erase everything: food, shelter, memory. The line between warmth and ruin was as thin as a breath. Villages burned often, sometimes whole rows of cottages in one night. Even as they prayed to God for protection, they knew that the same flame that blessed them could also consume them. This duality, this constant tension between need and fear, gave fire its sacredness. It was mercy and judgment at once, and every family carried that knowledge in their bones. To tend it was an act of devotion. To lose it was a kind of death. When the peasants sat before their fires at night, they saw in its glow not only light but reflection, the slow pulse of their own endurance. The embers whispered quietly, pulsing with colour like a living heart. And perhaps that was why the old ones sometimes said that when a man died, his hearth went cold with him, the flame that once mirrored his spirit fading to ash. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can imagine it. That dark, smoky room, the faint orange flicker across rough walls, the steady breathing of those who sit in its glow. The fire does not roar. It murmurs, patient and alive, holding in its glow every prayer, every story, every heartbeat of the people who built their lives around it. As the fire settled into its evening rhythm, flickering low but steady, the home transformed. The labor of the day was finished. The wind hissed softly against the walls, and in that narrow space between exhaustion and sleep, the peasants found something precious: time to speak, to remember, to be human again. There was no greater luxury in the Middle Ages than warmth and stillness, and so, when both were finally won for the night, the hearth became a small stage for stories. The children crept closer, faces glowing gold in the half-dark, their breath slow, their eyes wide. The adults sat behind them, too tired to move, hands resting on knees, their minds wandering through the slow smoke that curled toward the rafters. The father might begin with a tale of his youth, a winter so fierce that birds froze mid-flight, or a time when the river turned to ice so thick that carts crossed it safely. The mother might follow with something softer, a folk prayer, a riddle, a song learned from her own mother, sung so quietly it almost blended with the sigh of the fire. Sometimes the stories were holy, of saints who tamed wolves with prayer, of angels disguised as beggars. Sometimes they were older, darker things, spirits that hid in snowdrifts, ghostly fires that led travelers astray, or the pale lady who knocked on doors before a storm. The firelight danced across the walls, and shadows became part of the story. Animals, faces, shapes flickering in rhythm with the voice. The youngest children believed those shapes were the souls of their ancestors listening, and no one ever told them otherwise. In truth, the adults believed something close to that themselves, for every word spoken by the hearth carried a kind of continuity, a reminder that memory was the only inheritance the poor could keep. Beyond the home, the same pattern repeated across the village. Each cottage glowed faintly in the dark, each family gathered around its small center of warmth, each voice rising and falling in the quiet air. The night became a great chorus of human breath and ember light, a tapestry of murmured tales drifting through smoke and frost. In that shared silence between homes there was community stronger than walls or roads. The stories were not for amusement alone. They were instruction, history, and prayer all at once. A child learned what courage meant from the tale of a ploughman who saved his neighbor in a snowstorm. A wife learned patience from the story of the woman who waited 3 winters for her husband to return from war. A husband learned humility from the legend of the rich man whose fire burned too bright and drew ruin. The lessons were never spoken directly. They were absorbed, carried, lived. And then there was laughter, small and weary but real. Someone would recall a mishap from the fields, a pig that ran off during market day, or a frozen bucket that refused to break loose from the well. The laughter rose and fell like a wave of warmth itself, chasing away the cold for a moment longer. In those hours before the fire dimmed to embers, the cottage felt vast, not a prison of mud and straw, but a world made whole by voices. When the stories ended, quiet returned. The fire sank lower, the smoke thinned, and only the sound of breathing filled the space. But even then, the tales did not vanish. They lingered in the air, woven into the soot and the walls, waiting to be told again. Each retelling was a spark passed from one generation to the next, proof that warmth could exist not only in flame but in memory. And so, long after the embers died, long after the cottage faded back into shadow, the stories burned on, invisible fires that no frost could ever extinguish. Outside the cottages, the world was locked in silence. The snow stretched over the fields like a great white shroud, and the air was so still that sound seemed to hang motionless. The village itself, a cluster of thatched roofs half buried in drifts, looked almost asleep, its narrow lanes carved through ice, its fences crusted with frost that sparkled faintly under the moon. Yet, even in that stillness, life persisted, quiet and stubborn. When dawn came pale and uncertain, the first sound was always the church bell, its tone carried through the frozen air, flat and clear, echoing from one end of the village to the other. It marked not just the hour, but the proof that the world still moved, that the heart of the community still beat beneath all that ice. Slowly, doors creaked open. Smoke rose from the low chimneys. A few figures emerged, wrapped in cloaks, heads bowed, boots crunching through snow as they made their way to the well or to the barns. The village square was little more than a patch of churned snow and frozen mud, but it was the center of everything. There, people exchanged a few words before returning to their homes. Conversation was brief. The cold pressed too close to linger. Yet those few words mattered. Small confirmations that no one had frozen in the night, that the sick still breathed, that the fire in old Martha's cottage still burned. The cold had taught them the value of knowing. In a world so fragile, every neighbor was a lifeline. Children appeared later in the morning, their laughter startling the silence like birdsong. They threw snow at each other, built rough figures from ice, and chased each other's footprints through the powder. Their cheeks burned red, their breath hung in the air like smoke, and though their clothes were ragged, their joy was bright and fierce. Even in hardship, childhood found a way. As day went on, the village moved in rhythm with the light. The blacksmith's hammer struck dull and slow, its sound muffled by the snow-covered walls. The baker stoked his oven, filling the air with a faint, sweet scent that spread like a promise. A woman carried firewood on her back, her shawl stiff with frost, and an old man led his cow through the narrow path between cottages, murmuring softly to the animal, as if it were his oldest friend. These were not grand acts, but the cold turned each one into a quiet triumph. Sometimes travellers passed through, peddlers with carts creaking under the weight of pots, candles, and cloth. The villagers would gather briefly around them, trading dried herbs or eggs for a few small treasures. A bit of salt, a new knife, a ribbon for a child. The visitors brought stories from distant towns, news of kings, wars, and strange weather. But most of all, they brought novelty, a spark from a wider world. When they left, the road swallowed them quickly, their figures fading into the white. At night, the village glowed faintly, a constellation of fires beneath the snow. From the hilltop it looked like the earth itself was breathing. Little plumes of smoke rising, dim orange flickers moving behind thin walls. Dogs barked, doors creaked, a baby cried in the distance, and above it all, the stars burned with cold light, so sharp and clear they seemed almost alive. The peasants looked up at them sometimes, after feeding the animals or fetching the last bucket of water, and felt small but not forgotten. The heavens were vast, yes, but they mirrored the pattern below, each star a tiny flame, each cottage a reflection of that same celestial fire. Perhaps that was why they prayed not to be spared the cold, but to have the strength to meet it. Because under that endless frost, the village was more than a cluster of huts. It was a single organism, breathing together, surviving together. Every light that stayed burning through the night was a quiet act of defiance, a whisper against the dark. And though they never thought of it in such words, the peasants of that frozen world lived by the same truth their ancestors had known since the first flame was struck. That warmth shared is warmth multiplied, and that even in the deepest winter, no one endures alone. In the deep of winter, when the snow buried the paths and the sun no longer rose high enough to warm the fields, people turned toward one another. The cold was not just a season, it was a test, a slow, unspoken trial that revealed what kind of heart a person carried. In a world where every fire could die, and every store of grain could run dry, kindness was not a virtue but a form of survival. Inside each cottage, life drew closer. Families who might quarrel in summer grew quiet in winter, bound by the same thin line of smoke rising from the hearth. The fire demanded peace. Anger wasted energy. Loud words stirred draughts, and silence kept the warmth near. They learned to live within the narrow limits of space, to move gently, to share what could not be replaced. Even the smallest act, a shared crust of bread, a blanket pulled over a sleeping child, carried the weight of devotion. Love, in such a world was practical. It was not poetry but labor, mending torn clothing by firelight, rubbing warmth back into numb fingers, fetching water before dawn so another wouldn't have to. Husbands spoke little, wives even less, but their care was visible in the gestures of work. A man would cut extra wood for his neighbor without being asked. A woman would send her eldest child to check on the widow at the edge of the village, carrying a bowl of broth still steaming from the pot. These were not favors. They were lifelines, threads that held the village together. Marriage, too, was forged in necessity. Winter left little room for pride or distance. Couples slept close, sharing warmth, their breath mingling in the dark. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by the fire, its light their only witness, its heat their shelter. Children conceived in those months were, in a way, born of the flame itself, their first heartbeat echoing the steady crackle of burning wood. Friendship took quieter forms. A neighbor's knock in the night might mean a roof beam had cracked under the snow, or a fire had gone out. Without hesitation, someone would rise, wrap themselves in wool, and carry a clay pot of glowing embers through the dark. There was no debt, no thanks required, only the understanding that someday soon the favor would return. The exchange of heat was an unspoken covenant older than faith. Even the poorest found ways to share. A spoonful of fat added to a neighbor's pot, a handful of straw for someone's bed, a story told to comfort a child who'd lost a parent to the cold. These small acts rippled outward, warming more than bodies. They reminded the living that they were not alone in their endurance. And yet, love in winter was not always gentle. The cold stripped away pretense, exposing the raw edges of hunger and fear. Tempers flared, despair crept in, and sometimes the fire in the hearth became the only one left between them. But even then, forgiveness came faster. There was no time to stay angry when survival depended on togetherness. The old people knew this best. They sat close to the fire, their skin lined like the walls of the cottage, their eyes reflecting both flame and memory. They had outlasted many winters, and their wisdom was simple. The warmth you keep in your heart burns longer than any log in the fire. So they taught their children to share, to endure, to speak softly and hold fast to one another when the nights grew long. Outside, the world froze. Inside, people learned to burn quietly, not in anger, but in love, duty, and patience. The cold became a sculptor of souls, shaping them into something enduring and strong. By spring, many would not survive. Yet those who did would carry in them a kind of warmth no season could take away, the warmth born not from wood or wool, but from the unbreakable bond of people who had faced the same winter and refused to let it win. For the medieval peasant, death was never far. It lingered in the cold corners of every home, in the silence after the wind stopped, in the heavy stillness that settled when the fire burned too low. Winter made that presence impossible to ignore. The boundary between the living and the dead felt thin when frost lay over the world like a shroud, and even the strongest flame could not fully chase away that sense of closeness. They did not speak of death with fear, but with familiarity. It was part of the rhythm of the seasons, just as natural as the turning of the soil or the passing of the moon. The church taught that suffering purified the soul, that hardship was the path to grace, and that every frostbitten morning brought one closer to salvation. The peasants believed this not because they were naive, but because it gave meaning to the struggle. The cold became more than an enemy. It became a teacher, reminding them that warmth was temporary, but virtue eternal. When someone died in winter, the burial could not always wait for the thaw. The ground was too hard to dig, and so bodies were sometimes kept in small chapels or sheds beside the church, wrapped in linen, candles burning beside them day and night. The villagers would take turns keeping watch, whispering prayers to keep the soul safe until spring opened the earth again. It was a duty performed without complaint, for they all knew their turn would one day come. Inside the cottages, people believed the spirits of the dead lingered in the smoke. When the fire popped unexpectedly, someone might murmur, "That's Father's spirit, reminding us he still watches." children learned not to fear it. The dead were not gone. They were part of the house, part of the warmth that filled it. On the longest nights, families would speak to them softly, asking for protection, thanking them for the year's harvest, promising to remember them when the thaw came. The cold months gave rise to a special kind of piety, quiet, patient, and inward. There were few grand gestures of devotion, only endurance and prayer. To wake before dawn and feed the animals in the biting air was itself an act of worship. To share bread when there was little left was a prayer made flesh. Even lighting the morning fire became a small ritual of resurrection, taking what had died in the night and bringing it back to life. Sometimes the villagers told stories of those who had not survived the cold, wanderers found frozen by the roadside, or travelers lost in the snow. They spoke of them not in horror but in reverence. The dead had become one with the season, their spirits carried by the wind that whispered through the eaves. When that wind moaned at night, some said it was the souls of the lost seeking the warmth they once knew. And so, when it blew too hard, mothers would throw a pinch of flour into the fire, saying softly, "For the cold ones." Even the smallest flicker of flame held a kind of holiness in that world, to guard it through the night, to keep it alive against the vast, devouring dark. This was the peasants' unspoken theology. The fire was their soul, fragile and bright, a reflection of divine endurance. The church might have spoken of heaven and hell, but in the huts of the poor, salvation was measured in embers. In the end, winter did not just test their bodies. It shaped their understanding of eternity. To survive was to believe in God, in each other, in the promise that warmth would return, even if not in this world. And so they lived, and worked, and prayed, carrying the knowledge that death was not an ending but a kind of thaw, the moment when the long frost of life finally melted into something greater. And when they spoke of those who had passed, they never said "he is gone." They said "his fire has gone quiet." A simple phrase, but one that held an entire philosophy, that the soul was flame, and the flame once given never truly vanished. It only changed form, joining the great warmth beyond the reach of winter. Each dawn in the medieval village began not with sunlight but with smoke, thin, grey and trembling, rising from the cold ashes of the night before. The peasants called it the breath of the house. In that first fragile light, the world felt half dead. Frost lay thick on the walls, the air stung the skin like needles, and the silence was so complete that even the smallest crack of wood sounded like thunder. Yet from this stillness, life always stirred again, slow, reluctant, but inevitable. The first to rise was often the mother, wrapped in a rough cloak, her breath white in the air. She crouched before the hearth where the fire had slept. Her hands, cracked from work and cold, brushed aside the grey ash, searching for the faintest red glow. If none remained, she reached for the flint and steel. The sound of it, sharp, rhythmic, insistent, filled the quiet, echoing like a prayer. When the spark finally caught, she leaned close, lips pursed, coaxing it to life. That moment, the flame trembling, the smoke curling upward, was the small miracle that began every day. The children, still half asleep beneath their blankets of straw and wool, would open their eyes to see the fire flicker back to life, and the cottage would slowly exhale the night. The smoke thickened first, then thinned as the fire grew stronger. A faint warmth spread through the air, chasing the frost from the walls, stirring the chickens awake in the corner. Outside, the frost still ruled the earth. The sun climbed reluctantly, barely warming the snow-covered fields. But inside the huts, the rhythm of life returned. A pot was hung above the flames, water began to hiss and bubble, and the smell of smoke and barley filled the air. The man of the house stirred, pulling on stiff boots, tying a length of cloth around his waist. The children rubbed their faces, whispering sleepily, their breath mingling with the first heat of the day. That first cup of warm broth or ale was sacred. It was not luxury. It was proof that the fire had survived, that another day had begun, that the darkness had been held at bay for one more turn of the earth. Each morning was a resurrection, not of glory but of endurance. The peasants never spoke of it as such, yet they lived it without words. When the door opened, and the first gust of cold swept in, the fire flared, startled but alive. The man stepped out into the pale dawn, his breath rising in great clouds, his boots crunching over the frozen earth. The world beyond the threshold looked empty and vast, the trees glittering with frost, the horizon blurred with mist. But somewhere, smoke rose from other roofs, other fires being born again. The village was waking as one body, each hearth a beating heart beneath the snow. Even in their exhaustion, the people felt this rhythm, a cycle of extinguishing and rekindling, of night and day, of death and life. It was the pulse of the world itself, mirrored in the fire they guarded. They did not call it faith, but that is what it was, a faith in repetition, in persistence, in the quiet certainty that life could always begin again from ash. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, the village was alive, smoke curling from chimneys, the sound of axes in the distance, dogs barking, the church bell tolling faintly through the air. Each house, each flame, had survived the night. And though no one spoke of it aloud, everyone knew what it meant, that once more they had outlasted the cold. For them, every dawn was a victory so small it could fit inside a single spark, and yet so immense it kept the world turning. The fire would die again, as all fires must. But tomorrow, with cracked hands and steady hearts, they would wake it once more, breathing light into darkness, and proving again that survival was a kind of grace. Over generations, the endless rhythm of frost and flame did more than shape the peasants' days. It sculpted their minds, their habits, their very way of understanding time. The seasons were not measured by dates or calendars, but by the behavior of the fire, the smell of the air, the color of the smoke that drifted over the village rooftops. Winter was not a passing condition. It was a culture, one that taught its own language of patience, ritual, and reverence for the fragile warmth that kept the world alive. Each village developed its own small customs to greet and endure the cold. Some families placed an extra log on the fire on the first night of frost, a gesture of welcome to winter's arrival, not out of joy, but out of respect, as if greeting an old, formidable guest who demanded hospitality. Others hung bundles of dried herbs above the hearth, not merely for their scent, but for luck, thyme for courage, rosemary for memory, sage for protection from spirits that wandered in the snow. Even the way they marked time came from the flame. The peasants spoke of fires ago, not months. It has been 10 fires since the ox fell ill, or 3 fires since the last snowfall. The hearth was their calendar, its ashes their diary. The life of the home moved with its pulse. When the smoke turned thick and white, it was morning. When the glow turned low and blue, it was time to sleep. The hours of the day were not counted by bells or clocks, but by the changing temper of the fire. Festivals in winter were built around light, fragile, flickering celebrations meant to defy the dark. On long nights, villagers gathered in the square with torches or candles, their faces glowing against the snow, singing hymns that mixed Christian praise with older earthbound chants. They called it driving out the cold, though they knew they could never truly do so. The songs were more for the soul than for the weather. Children carried small lanterns carved from turnips, their hollow faces grinning through the flame, symbols of endurance and laughter in the face of hardship. Superstition grew thick in that darkness. People believed that if your fire smoked too much, it meant someone in the family was hiding guilt. If a coal fell from the hearth and rolled toward the door, it foretold a visitor. If it rolled inward, a birth or blessing. A sudden gust that snuffed the flame was seen as an omen, the breath of a wandering soul passing through. Some women claimed to read the year's fortune in the way the fire cracked on New Year's Eve. Sharp pops meant quarrels ahead, a soft murmur promised peace. Through repetition, these customs became faiths of their own. The church did not condemn them, not fully, because it understood that such beliefs made the cold survivable. They gave meaning to the endless waiting, the endless dark. For every superstition held a grain of truth. The fire did respond to care, and neglect did breed misfortune. In the heart of poverty, meaning was the only warmth that could not be taken away. As winter deepened, time itself seemed to stretch. Days blurred together under the same dim light, the same muted tasks, the same faces around the same hearth. And yet, this monotony gave comfort. To know exactly what each day would bring, to wake to the same sounds, to see the same smoke curling in the same pattern, was to feel safe in a world that otherwise offered no guarantees. Routine became religion, familiarity became hope. Even the children learned to read the signs of cold as fluently as letters, the way ice crept across the windows at dawn, the smell of burning peat when wood was scarce, the texture of snow that foretold rain or thaw. They grew up fluent in the language of survival, inheriting not books or money, but instincts: when to stir the fire, when to seal the door, when to share, when to pray. Thus winter became more than a season. It became their teacher, their faith, their culture. It taught them that everything was borrowed: heat, food, breath, time, and that life, at its truest, was not measured by abundance but by endurance, by how long one could hold a single flame against the dark. Change in the medieval world did not arrive as revolution. It crept quietly, like dawn through a shuttered window. For centuries the peasant's life was ruled by fire and frost, by instinct, not invention. Yet little by little, a new kind of thinking began to stir within the smoke. The same hands that patched walls and mended thatch started to imagine ways not merely to endure the cold, but to soften it. These were not the grand inventions of kings or scholars, but the small, practical genius of survival, the first sparks of comfort flickering in the darkness. The earliest change came from the hearth itself. Families began to experiment with stones, large, flat slabs placed behind or around the fire to trap and release heat slowly through the night. Some noticed that houses built against south-facing slopes stayed warmer, the sun lending its faint help through daylight hours. Builders learned to position hearths near central walls, letting the warmth seep through adjoining spaces. It was crude architecture by modern standards, but it marked the first shift from reaction to design, the moment humans stopped merely enduring nature and began to negotiate with it. In certain wealthier villages, blacksmiths started forging small iron grates to lift the fire from the ground, allowing air to pass beneath the coals and burn cleaner. The change seemed simple, but it transformed everything. Less smoke, steadier flames, more heat. Families spoke of these new hearths in hushed admiration, as though they were half magic. A well-made grate could last generations, passed down like a relic of warmth. Another innovation came from the north, a device called the smoke hood. Rather than letting smoke escape freely through a hole in the roof, some clever minds began funneling it through a crude wooden funnel, lined with clay or stone, to direct it outward. It was the ancestor of the chimney, and it changed daily life in ways no one could have predicted. The air grew clearer, the walls darkened more slowly, people could hang their herbs and meats higher without choking on soot. A simple funnel of stone had freed them, in part from the tyranny of their own fire. With these small changes came others. Potters began crafting thicker clay tiles and flue pipes to line hearth walls, discovering by accident that baked clay absorbed and radiated heat long after the fire died. A handful of monasteries even recorded experiments with enclosed stoves, large iron boxes that trapped the heat and released it gradually through tiny vents. Monks, ever in search of stillness, found them perfect for scriptoria where the breath of cold had long made writing an ordeal. But among peasants, innovation spread slower, filtered through necessity and rumour. When one village found a better way to hold heat, another copied it only when the need grew desperate. Still, progress was steady, invisible yet unstoppable. The thatched cottages remained humble, but their fires burned a little cleaner, their walls a little tighter, their winters a little kinder. It is easy to forget, centuries later, that every modern comfort, every radiator, stove and furnace, was born from this world of smoke and frost. Central heating did not emerge from laboratories or royal courts, but from generations of tired hands learning, testing, failing, and trying again. The peasants' endurance was not just survival, it was experimentation, slow and patient. Some say humanity's greatest invention was not the wheel or the plough, but the controlled hearth, the moment when fire stopped being wild and became domestic, when warmth became something that could be kept, guarded, even shared. From that moment onward, every winter grew a little less cruel. And yet, for all these new comforts, one thing never changed: the reverence for flame itself. No matter how clever their devices, people still treated fire as a living soul, unpredictable, sacred, and alive. When a new hearth was built, the first spark was never struck cold. It was taken from an existing flame, carried carefully in a clay bowl, so that the new fire would inherit the spirit of the old. Warmth, like life, was meant to be passed on, not created from nothing. So the world warmed, one ember at a time, and as the centuries turned, those faint glimmers of ingenuity, a stone wall, a smoke hood, a clay pipe glowing faintly after dusk, would become the foundation of something unimaginable to those who first tended the fire, a world where warmth no longer depended on the vigilance of human hands. But that was still far away. For now, the peasants of the Middle Ages lived in the tender balance between invention and endurance, between faith and frost. They did not yet know that their struggle to keep the fire alive would ignite an age of comfort to come, a transformation born not from luxury, but from the slow, patient genius of the cold. It began almost unnoticed, a trickle of smoke rising straight and true into the sky instead of curling aimlessly through the rafters. In the late Middle Ages, around the 14th century, a quiet revolution was taking shape, one brick at a time. The chimney, simple, vertical, and astonishing, was about to change the very soul of the medieval home. For generations, the peasant's world had been built around smoke, eyes that watered, lungs that rasped, rafters blackened, until they gleamed like coal. The air inside a cottage was as much a part of the family as the people themselves, thick, breathing, alive. But with the arrival of the chimney, the air began to clear, and so did the rhythm of life. The first chimneys appeared in the halls of the wealthy, those vast stone chambers where lords and ladies once sat in clouds of their own making. Their hearths, once open pits in the center of the room, moved to the wall. Brick funnels rose above them, carrying the smoke safely outside. It seems simple now, but to those who saw it first, it was almost alchemy, a structure that tamed smoke itself. The hearth became cleaner, safer, more efficient. Rooms could finally be divided. Warmth no longer demanded one great smoky hall, but could exist in smaller private spaces. The idea of rooms, true rooms, was born from that rising column of brick and ash. The technology trickled downward slowly. Stone masons carried the knowledge from castle to monastery, from monastery to manor, and from manor, eventually, to village. By the 15th century, even modest cottagers began to dream of chimneys, though most peasants could only watch the new designs take shape in the homes of priests and reeves. For many, the old open hearth still burned on the floor, its smoke still finding its own stubborn path out through the roof. But word spread quickly. A neighbor's home that no longer filled with soot, where drying herbs stayed bright green instead of black, became the envy of all. And with the chimney came a shift far greater than warmth: privacy. Families who could build small hearths in separate rooms began to live differently. The great communal space that had once bound everyone, parents, children, animals alike, began to fracture into smaller, quieter worlds. The fire that once belonged to all now belonged to each. Warmth for the first time became personal. Inside these new homes, the air felt new, lighter, cleaner, almost foreign. Walls were whitewashed to reflect a clearer light. Ceilings stayed pale instead of sooty. The smell of wood smoke, once heavy and ever-present, grew faint. People began hanging tapestries not just for decoration, but to keep the heat in. Windows grew larger, though still dim. The sense of enclosure softened. The house became a vessel of comfort, not merely survival. Historians sometimes call the chimney the quiet beginning of modernity. It allowed the home to evolve from a shelter into a space of thought, conversation, rest. It gave birth to solitude, to the idea that a man might sit alone by his fire, reflecting rather than huddling with his family for heat. In that moment, comfort and individuality were born together. Yet the peasants did not lose their awe for fire. If anything, the chimney deepened it. They called the upward-drawing wind inside it the breath of God, believing that it carried their prayers along with the smoke. To clean a chimney was not just maintenance, it was a sacred act, ensuring the path between heaven and hearth remained clear. The change did not come easily. Chimneys were costly, their mortar prone to cracking, their stones to collapsing. A poorly built one could suck the heat away instead of keeping it, or worse, set the roof aflame. But when they worked, when the smoke rose in perfect rhythm with the fire below, the home itself seemed to breathe with relief. In the centuries that followed, the chimney would become the symbol of civilization, a sign that a home had not only survived but advanced. It stood tall against the sky like a flag of human endurance, whispering its thin grey plume into the cold. For the medieval peasant, it was not just a new way to warm the body. It was the first step toward a new way of living, one where warmth could be trusted, where comfort could be designed, where the fire no longer ruled but served. And though the night outside still howled with frost and wind, the sight of smoke rising gently from a single chimney was enough to tell the world below. Here in this small circle of brick and breath, humanity had claimed victory over the cold. By the late Middle Ages, warmth itself had become a craft. The simple open fire that once glowed at the centre of every cottage had evolved into something deliberate, shaped by skill, calculation, and quiet artistry. This was the beginning of the stove, the dawn of those who could build and tame heat with stone and metal. They were called hearthsmiths, neither masons nor blacksmiths entirely, but something between the two, and their work transformed the very heartbeat of winter. It began, as most revolutions do, in the coldest places, in the mountain valleys of Germany and Bohemia, where frost lingered for half the year. Masons began to notice something curious. The thick walls of their stone ovens stayed warm long after the fire had died. By sealing the flame inside and letting it burn slower, they could trap the heat within the masonry itself. These first cachalofens, or tile stoves, were immense, beautiful structures of brick and ceramic. When touched in the morning, they still radiated warmth from the night before. The idea spread, first to monasteries where monks used them to heat their silent scriptoria, then to the homes of merchants and mayors. The stove was not only efficient, it was transformative. For the first time in history, a room could stay warm without choking on smoke. The fire had become invisible, enclosed behind doors of iron and tile, yet its presence filled every corner of the space. In northern Italy, artisans developed their own versions, smaller, graceful, often adorned with glazed tiles in deep greens and ochres. These were not merely tools but works of devotion. Some were carved with saints and symbols, others bore the crests of noble families, blending piety and pride in a single radiant object. A fine stove was a mark of sophistication, a promise that even in the coldest season, civilization endured. Meanwhile, in the humble cottages of England and France, change came more slowly. Peasants still relied on open fires, though whispers of new designs reached even their ears. It was said that some lords could warm entire halls with a single stove, that their walls glowed faintly at night, and that their clothes dried without the sting of smoke. To the poor, such tales sounded almost like miracles. Warmth without choking, heat without fire's chaos. But ingenuity trickled downward in unexpected ways. Local blacksmiths, seeing these new wonders from afar, began forging smaller iron boxes for cooking and heating. They called them fireboxes or warming chests. Crude but effective, these early prototypes were the ancestors of the cast iron stoves that would one day fill homes across Europe. Peasants who could not afford them learned to line their hearths with stones to trap the heat longer, or to use broken pottery as makeshift tiles, small gestures toward the same dream: control. The mastery of warmth was no longer spiritual alone. It was becoming technical. Fire was not just prayed to, it was studied. Monks measured airflow with parchment flaps. Craftsmen tested chimney drafts with feathers and smoke trails, and builders learned how to curve walls to reflect heat more evenly. In their own way, they were scientists of survival, centuries before the word existed. Still, the reverence never faded. A fire that burned too fast was said to be proud. One that smoldered too long was lazy. To build the perfect fire was to strike a moral balance between passion and restraint, between life and danger. People began to say, "A good fire behaves like a good man, steady, patient and generous with warmth." By the 15th century, the art of the hearth had become the silent mark of progress. The great castles of Bavaria, the guild halls of Flanders, the monasteries of the Alps, all glowed from within, their tiled stoves humming softly with stored heat. Outside, frost still ruled the fields and froze the rivers solid. But inside, humanity had learned something profound. Warmth could be engineered. This was more than invention. It was emancipation. A quiet, glowing revolution against the tyranny of winter. For the first time, a person could sleep without fear that the fire might die, could breathe without coughing, could live within walls that held the memory of the flame. From this mastery would come chimneys that drew true, stoves that sealed perfectly, furnaces that breathed with precision, and, centuries later, the quiet hum of central heating itself. But in that first moment, when a peasant or monk or lord placed a hand on a warm tile and felt heat pulsing long after the fire was gone, it must have seemed like sorcery. For millennia, warmth had been fleeting, something to chase and guard. Now, for the first time, humanity had learned to keep it. By the time the 15th century began to fade, the relationship between humankind and fire had changed forever. What was once an untamed force of nature, smoky, dangerous, and alive, had been domesticated. The hearth, which for thousands of years had been a crude pit in the floor, had become a symbol, a heart, a soul contained in stone and iron. And with that shift, warmth itself ceased to be merely survival. It became comfort, identity, and memory. The house was no longer just a shell against the cold. It was a sanctuary built around the promise of flame. For the first time, people began to describe homes not by their walls or fields, but by their fires. "He has a good hearth" became a way of saying a man lived well, decently, with steadiness and care. To lose one's fire was to lose one's life, one's name, one's place in the village. The new hearths, with their chimneys, iron doors, and tiled stoves, changed more than temperature. They changed how people felt. The air grew clearer, the walls cleaner, the light softer. Families could see each other across the room without squinting through smoke. Children played closer to the fire, not fearing the choking haze of the old days. Women could cook with precision instead of improvisation, their faces no longer stung by ash. Slowly, imperceptibly, daily life became gentler. And from that gentleness grew something else: reflection. Warmth gave people time to think, to talk, to dream. Evenings once filled with coughing and shivering became hours of storytelling, mending, and song. The flame no longer ruled them. It listened. The firelight became the first lamp of thought, flickering on faces that had learned at last to rest. In those rooms, the idea of home took root in a new way. The hearth became its center, a symbol not just of warmth but of belonging. To sit by the fire was to be among one's own, to be safe, to be remembered. Poets began to use the word fireside to mean love, peace, and continuity. a place where generations could gather, where stories could be told, and where the world outside could freeze without fear. The church too noticed this change. Sermons began to speak of the hearth as sacred, a miniature altar of domestic life. Priests would bless new chimneys, sprinkling holy water on the stones so that no ill wind shall take the smoke astray. The flame, once divine mystery, had come home to live among people, humbler but closer than ever. Even superstition softened. The old hearth spirits, once feared as moody guardians, became friendly house protectors, small imagined beings who kept the fire burning when no one was watching. Mothers would tell their children to leave a crumb of bread near the ashes. For the hearth folk, a small act of gratitude for the warmth that carried them through the night. Architects too began to think differently. They built chimneys tall enough to draw cleanly and hearths deep enough to hold steady fire. The stonework grew ornate, carved mantels, decorated grates, iron tools forged into delicate shapes. A visitor could know a household's wealth and character simply by glancing at its fireplace. The hearth was art, status, and symbol all at once, the heart of civilization's first domestic pride. And yet, even as the fire became cleaner and more beautiful, something primal endured. People still sat close, still watched the embers as though listening to an ancient language. The same instinct that once made peasants huddle together in the smoke, now made families gather in comfort, drawn not by need, but by memory. The fire had ceased to be master or threat. It had become companion. When night fell and the last log glowed red, the hush that followed felt almost holy. The warmth lingered on the walls, the faint hum of the stove like a sleeping breath. Outside, frost still bit the fields and blackened the sky, but inside there was a calm unknown to earlier centuries, a sense that humanity had at last made peace with the cold. From this peace, the modern world would be born, the houses of brick and glass, the cities filled with steady warmth, the hum of furnaces and radiators that would one day replace the flame. Yet somewhere within all that progress, the memory of the hearth endures, the flicker, the glow, the sound of wood sighing into ash. Because every home, no matter how advanced, still carries a spark of that first fire, the one that burned in the dark while snow fell outside, and people, wrapped in patience and smoke, learned that warmth was not just heat, but belonging. By the 16th century, Europe was changing, not only in its art and wars and kingdoms, but in the quiet rhythm of its domestic life. The old smoke-blackened cottages were giving way to stone manors and timber-framed houses with windows, chimneys, and carefully laid hearths. Warmth was no longer a fleeting guest, but a tenant of its own, invited, guided, and, for the first time, controlled. Humanity had begun to dream of everlasting heat, a fire that would never die, a warmth that would live through the night without tending. It began fittingly in the homes of scholars and nobles, men obsessed with precision, symmetry, and order. The great houses of the Renaissance were not just monuments to wealth. They were experiments in comfort. Masons and metalworkers collaborated with thinkers and physicians to study how air and smoke moved through enclosed spaces. A new word entered conversation: ventilatio, the movement of breath through walls and pipes, the controlled exchange between cold and warm. Some of the earliest experiments in central heating came from this age of curiosity. In monasteries, underground flues carried warm air from a single furnace into the floors above, gently warming stone corridors where monks copied manuscripts in silence. Castles in France and Germany adopted similar ideas, their fireplaces connected by hidden ducts and clay channels. It was primitive, unreliable, and often dangerous, but the concept was revolutionary. Fire was no longer confined to one corner. It could travel, unseen, through the bones of the building. In Nuremberg, records from the 1500s described stove rooms, chambers heated by great masonry ovens in adjoining walls. The fire was fed from one side, the heat radiated through the other. This allowed warmth without smoke, a separation of labor and comfort that astonished travelers. "One may sit in the chamber as in a spring garden," wrote an English visitor, "though the snow beats against the glass." The miracle was not fire, but its taming, the transformation of a raw elemental force into a servant of human rhythm. Meanwhile, craftsmen continued to refine the materials that carried heat. Tiles were no longer simple clay but glazed ceramics, their colors reflecting not just beauty but function: glossy green to retain warmth, deep blue to withstand the flame's bite. Metalworkers too discovered that iron could hold and release heat with astonishing steadiness. From their hands came the first cast iron firebacks, embossed with patterns of vines and saints, each one turning heat into art. In cities, as houses grew larger and closer together, the idea of shared warmth began to take hold. Inns and taverns built great hearths with vents that spread the heat to nearby rooms. Hospitals designed long central fires to warm patients in adjoining wards. Warmth became communal again, not the desperate huddling of peasants, but an organized generosity of architecture. Still, the dream of perfect, constant heat remained elusive. Fire was temperamental, smoke unpredictable, air restless. Even in grand palaces, drafts crawled through corridors and froze the ink in the inkwells of scholars. But humanity was close, closer than it had ever been. The great thinkers of the era began to write about heat as if it were a measurable thing, a quality that could be directed, captured, improved. The philosopher Francis Bacon wrote that heat is a motion, an invisible trembling of matter that might one day be understood. It was the first whisper of modern science, born beside the hearth. And yet, amid all this innovation, the fire remained a symbol of the eternal, a spiritual center as much as a physical one. Painters placed it at the heart of domestic scenes. Poets called it the sun of the home. Even as new furnaces and ducts appeared, no invention could replace the soft flicker of a real flame, the sound of wood crackling, the scent of smoke curling through still air. It was not just warmth that people wanted, but the feeling of warmth, the light, the presence, the living pulse. By the dawn of the 17th century, houses had become intricate bodies of heat and breath. The poorest still shivered in their mud-brick cottages, but the middle ranks of society, merchants, priests, craftsmen, had entered a new world of comfort. They could work by winter's light without numb fingers, dine by steady fire, and dream of a time when no one would ever wake to cold ashes again. They could not have known that their slow experiments, their chimneys, their tiled stoves, their secret flues and vents, were the ancestors of what we now take for granted. The dream of everlasting warmth, born in smoke and soot, would one day hum through the walls in silence, invisible yet ever present. And though the fire would eventually vanish from most homes, its ghost would remain. In the hum of the radiator, the whisper of a furnace, the steady breath of modern heat. We no longer see it, but we still live by its rhythm, as those peasants once did, gathered around the fragile light that first taught humankind what it meant to endure. By the dawn of the industrial age, the human relationship with warmth, once so intimate, so personal, began to change beyond recognition. The flickering heart of the home, the sacred fire that had glowed for millennia in stone hearths and tiled stoves, was about to be replaced by something vast, loud, and impersonal. The old partnership between man and flame, nurtured in patience and prayer, would be rewritten in iron, steam, and coal. It began in England, where the ground itself became a furnace. Beneath the green hills of the Midlands, miners hacked their way through veins of black rock that burned hotter and longer than any log. Coal was not just fuel, it was condensed time. The sun's ancient memory turned to stone. When it caught fire, it changed everything. The old wood-burning hearths were no match for its power. The first to embrace it were the blacksmiths and glassmakers, then the bakers, and finally the households of the cities. By the 18th century, the scent of coal smoke had become the smell of civilization itself, acrid, dense, and everywhere. From that coal came steam, and from steam a new kind of warmth, mechanical, relentless, unblinking. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen built his first atmospheric engine, a monstrous creation that hissed and groaned as it pumped water from the mines. It was the first time in history that fire had been turned into motion, that heat had become labor. Within a century it would move trains, power factories, and warm entire cities. The miracle of warmth had been industrialized. In great brick buildings across Europe, engineers experimented with what they called central furnaces. One roaring fire in the basement could send warmth through iron pipes to every room above. The rich could now live in houses that glowed evenly, without smoke or draught. The peasants who had once prayed for their hearth's survival would not have recognized this new world, a place where fire no longer lived among the people, but beneath them, caged and controlled. The first boilers were monstrous things, iron beasts that hissed and thumped, their bellies full of flame. Men tended them like priests of a new religion, feeding coal through metal mouths, adjusting levers, watching pressure dials with anxious reverence. A single mistake could mean explosion. Fire had not been tamed, only transformed, from a companion to a captive. And yet, with this captivity came abundance. Entire hospitals could now be warmed. Schools, libraries, and factories glowed through the winter, without fear of frost. Heat no longer depended on the steady hand of a housewife or the faith of a peasant. It was constant, automatic, tireless. Humanity had done what it had dreamed of since the first cave fire. It had built warmth that never died. But something else faded in that exchange. The sight, the sound, the ritual. Children no longer grew up watching their mothers coax a flame from cold ash. The scent of smoke no longer lingered on clothes. The evening silence was no longer broken by the quiet pop of sap inside burning wood. Warmth had become invisible, and in that invisibility a certain tenderness disappeared. Cities filled with smoke from a million chimneys, the sky itself turning grey from humanity's hunger for heat. The same coal that made homes comfortable made the air unbreathable. Progress came at a price the peasants of old could never have imagined. Where once the village fire had bound people together, now the new fires, the industrial ones, separated them, each person enclosed in private warmth, each home sealed away behind its own invisible flame. And yet, deep inside this transformation, something ancient still flickered. People placed mantles above their radiators. They decorated their new, useless fireplaces with candles. They built parlors around imitation hearths, small, artificial shrines to the memory of the real thing. The instinct to gather around a source of light and warmth could not be erased, only reimagined. The machine had stolen the fire, but not the longing for it. Humanity had built warmth without flame, and in doing so had discovered how much it missed the flicker of the old one. By the 19th century, the world no longer woke to the crackle of the hearth. It woke to the hiss of steam, to the clang of metal, to the pulse of pistons hammering deep within the heart of cities. Heat had escaped the home. It had become the blood of civilization. What once warmed a single cottage now powered empires. The age of steam was an age of conquest, not only of land, but of nature itself. Across Britain, black clouds rose from thousands of chimneys, rolling over the skyline like manufactured weather. Coal fed the furnaces of progress. Locomotives thundered across the countryside, their boilers glowing red beneath iron skins. Steamships crossed oceans against the wind. Mills spun day and night under the relentless heat of their engines. Humanity had learned to forge warmth into motion, to turn fire into will. But even as cities grew and machines roared, the domestic world followed suit. The same principle that moved locomotives began to hum quietly beneath parlors and bedrooms. Central heating, once a curiosity of palaces and monasteries, entered the homes of the middle class. In the basements of London and Paris, cast iron boilers throbbed like mechanical hearts, sending hot water through a network of pipes to radiators that gleamed like new inventions of comfort. These radiators, elegant, ribbed, and heavy, were works of art as much as machinery. They replaced the hearth not by imitation, but by evolution. No smoke, no tending, no danger, just a steady, invisible pulse of warmth that filled the air like music without sound. For the first time in history, winter could be ignored. People began to speak of indoor seasons, the strange new experience of living in summer while snow fell outside. This miracle of heat transformed architecture itself. Ceilings grew higher, windows larger, homes expanded beyond the logic of survival. In the age of the hearth, walls had embraced their occupants. Now they withdrew, confident that the pipes would do the work. Warmth was no longer earned but expected. The home became less about endurance and more about expression. Velvet curtains, wallpaper, polished wood, all made possible by the steady breath of the boiler below. The industrial furnace had conquered more than the climate. It had conquered time. Nights grew longer, days stretched with the help of gaslight and steam, and human labor no longer bowed to the rhythm of the sun. Fire had once told humanity when to rest. Now the new fire, the hidden iron one, told it to keep going. And yet, amid this astonishing triumph, nostalgia stirred. Writers began to mourn the old flame. In Dickens' London, the soot of progress blackened everything it touched, and the glowing hearth became a symbol of innocence lost. Painters returned to scenes of peasants gathered by candlelight, not as reality but as memory, the gentle glow of a simpler age. The world had grown warm, but also lonely. In the countryside, where industry's roar was distant, the old traditions lingered. Cottages still burned wood, families still told stories by the flicker of flame, and the rhythm of night and day still pulsed with the fire's heartbeat. But even there, progress was inevitable. Cast iron stoves appeared in farmhouses, efficient and coldly perfect. The fire was still present, but it was contained, caged, disciplined. Steam had made the world move, but it had also stripped warmth of its soul. The hearth, once a living center of breath, prayer, and patience, had become a piece of machinery. The intimacy between man and flame, that ancient dialogue whispered through smoke, was now reduced to valves and pressure gauges. And yet, humanity could not let go of its oldest companion. In parlors and salons across Europe, people gathered not around the radiator, but still, instinctively, around whatever flickered, a candle, a lamp, the orange glow of coal behind a grate. The shape of the gathering had not changed in thousands of years. Only the source of the light had. The empire of steam had given mankind mastery over winter, but also, quietly, a longing for its old humility. For in conquering cold, humanity had lost the ceremony of survival, that sacred daily act of coaxing flame from ash, of watching it breathe, of being reminded that life too must be tended or it fades. The 20th century dawned without smoke. The first light of modernity was not the orange flicker of flame, but the cold, steady glow of electricity. With the turn of a switch, light appeared where no wick burned, warmth flowed where no coal smouldered, and fire, the ancient companion of humankind, began to vanish from daily life. For the first time in history, the world lived without tending its own flame. Gas and electricity changed everything. Cities that had once slept under a veil of soot now shone with immaculate light. The air cleared, the walls stayed white, and the scent of ash, once the smell of existence itself, faded into memory. Heat came now from silent machines, from pipes and wires, from thermostats that regulated comfort with mathematical precision. Warmth no longer depended on ritual, on patience, or even on awareness. It simply was. In urban apartments, radiators hissed softly like tamed serpents, their heat constant and uncomplaining. Kitchens glowed not with wood smoke, but with the blue halo of gas flames, small, perfect, obedient. The great hearths of the past, once wide enough for a man to stand in, were bricked over, turned into niches for decoration or the storage of books. The new fire lived behind walls, beneath floors, inside machines. Humanity, at last, had achieved what it always sought, warmth without struggle. But as the visible fire disappeared, so too did something ineffable, a sense of presence. Generations raised in its glow, had lived by its rhythms, gathering as it burned, listening as it spoke, reading its moods in crackle and ember. Now the fire's language fell silent. Children no longer learned how to feed it, how to read its color, how to honor it. They grew up in rooms that were always warm, rooms that no longer breathed. The world grew brighter, but less alive. In the electric light, night lost its mystery. In the hiss of radiators, silence lost its weight. The flame that had once united families, that fragile, flickering center of shared existence, was replaced by the hum of current, the whisper of gas, the invisible pulse of power grids that spanned the earth. Warmth had become a rite, not a miracle. And yet, even as people embraced this new perfection, they began to mourn what they had left behind. In the mid-century homes of America and Europe, architects designed fireplaces that no one needed. They were purely symbolic, tiled, electric, ornamental, places to gather, not for heat, but for memory. The hearth had become an idea, a relic of meaning, a small portal to an older rhythm of being. Writers, too, felt the absence. Poets spoke of the hollow warmth of modern life, of light without soul. Painters returned to the glow of the hearth as a symbol of intimacy, a reminder that progress, for all its miracles, could not replace belonging. Even the earliest electric advertisements, flickering in their neon glow, mimicked the color of fire, as though humanity, unable to let go, painted its new world in the shade of its oldest friend. The fire had gone underground, not only beneath floors and behind furnaces, but into memory. Its warmth lived on in language. We still kindle love, spark ideas, burn with anger, glow with pride. We still speak as though our hearts were hearths. The vocabulary of flame remains, because its spirit never left. It merely changed form. By the end of the century, the modern world had mastered warmth completely. Satellites tracked storms, thermostats adjusted automatically, furnaces whispered in basements, and people moved through endless, perfect climates of their own making. Yet, in that perfection, something ancient stirred, an ache, a nostalgia for the imperfection of flame. And so, in cities of glass and steel, humanity began to bring fire back, not out of need, but out of longing. Candles flickered in restaurants, fireplaces burned behind glass in modern apartments, campfires crackled on electric screens. The flame, once banished, had returned, no longer master, no longer servant, but symbol. A reminder that for all our progress, we remain what we always were, creatures who gather around light in the dark, seeking not just warmth, but connection. For in every glowing filament, every dancing pixel, every soft orange hue cast by a screen in a sleeping room, the same ancient truth endures. The fire never left us. We only forgot how to see it. In the end, after all the centuries of smoke and soot, after the coal and the steam and the silent heat of wires, humanity finds itself once again before the fire, though it no longer burns in stone hearths or glows beneath cauldrons of iron. It burns within us. The story of warmth is the story of civilization itself, a tale that began in darkness, when our ancestors crouched beside a trembling spark and realized that life could be something more than endurance. Every step that followed, every chimney raised, every stove built, every furnace forged, was an act of faith in that discovery. To build a fire was to declare that the world could be shaped, that nature could be met, not with fear, but with imagination. The peasants who once whispered prayers into the smoke, the monks who measured heat through clay walls, the engineers who forged radiators and boilers, all were participants in the same quiet miracle, turning survival into art. Fire taught us everything: how to cook, how to build, how to gather, how to dream. It taught us to share warmth, to pass it hand to hand, generation to generation, until it became more than heat. It became compassion. And though the visible flame has faded from our homes, it remains within our symbols, our language, our souls. We still speak of the spark of genius, of love that burns bright, of anger that flares, of hope that glows. These are not metaphors by accident. They are memories, the residue of a time when the line between life and fire was thin and sacred. If we listen carefully, even now, the fire still speaks. In the hum of the heater, in the pulse of a filament, in the golden shimmer of evening light, it murmurs its old truth, that to live is to tend something fragile. That warmth, whether of hearth or of heart, survives only through care. And perhaps that is why, no matter how advanced we become, we return to it. We light candles in churches, bonfires on beaches, lanterns in remembrance. We still gather in circles, faces lit by flickering orange, voices softened by its glow. We recreate the ancient scene again and again, as if instinct alone remembers what reason has forgotten, that no matter how far we go, we remain children of the flame, the peasants of the frozen world, the monks by their stoves, the miners feeding coal to the engines of empire. They all lived beneath the same truth that holds us now. Fire is not what separates us from nature, but what binds us to it. It is our mirror, our teacher, our reflection in the dark. Someday, even the machines that warm us will grow quiet. The furnaces will cool, the circuits will fade, and the earth will reclaim its silence. But somewhere, someone will strike a spark out of need or ritual or memory, and the circle will begin again. The light will grow, and with it, the story. Because humanity's oldest prayer was never spoken in words. It was whispered in flame, and even now it burns, patient, waiting, eternal.